Ruth Calloway was 73 years old when she learned that losing everything doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It arrives quietly, disguised as a missed bill, a cold shoulder, a son who stops looking you in the eye at dinner. And then one Tuesday morning in Harwick, Ohio, she found herself standing on a cracked sidewalk with 2 suitcases, a cardboard box of books, and exactly $5 in her coat pocket, the last physical currency she had in the world. That $5 bill, wrinkled and soft from years of circulation, would soon unlock a secret that had been buried for 4 decades, expose a mystery that federal investigators had spent millions trying to solve, and rebuild a life that everyone around her had quietly decided was finished. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. People who have never been truly poor, not inconvenienced, not temporarily tight, but genuinely absolutely poor, tend to imagine it happens fast. A single catastrophic event, a diagnosis, a fire, a crash, something you can point to on a calendar and say, that's the day. But Ruth had come to understand, in the long quiet months leading up to that Tuesday morning, that real financial collapse is almost always slow. It is bureaucratic. It is humiliating in the most mundane possible ways. It is a stack of envelopes you start recognizing by color before you even open them. It is the moment you realize you've been mentally calculating the cost of groceries by the item for longer than you can remember. Ruth had worked for 41 years as a librarian and senior archivist for the Harwick County Public Library System. She had cataloged rare documents, preserved fragile manuscripts, managed collections that dated back to the early 1800s. She had raised Dennis largely on her own after his father left when Dennis was 9, had put him through college with a combination of financial aid and every extra shift she could pick up, had attended every graduation, every wedding, every birth of every grandchild with the particular quiet pride of a woman who had built something out of very little. The house on Eldridge Street had been hers for 31 years, a modest 2-bedroom with a leaking gutter she'd been meaning to fix and a garden she'd tended with the same careful patience she gave to rare documents at work. When she retired at 70, her pension was modest but manageable. Then her hip went. The surgery was more complicated than expected. Recovery stretched from weeks into months. Medical bills accumulated with the same quiet relentlessness as the overdue notices had in previous years. She refinanced once to cover the debt, then again, and then the pension adjustment notice arrived, a bureaucratic recalculation that reduced her monthly income by $340 due to a decades-old clerical enrollment error she'd had no knowledge of. She asked Dennis for help, not money, just time, a few months to get back on her feet, stabilize her finances, figure out a path forward. Dennis and his wife Carol had a large house in the newer part of Harwick. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement. They said yes, of course. Come stay with us, Mom. And Ruth had been genuinely grateful, had tried to be invisible, helpful, unobtrusive. She cooked when Carol worked late. She helped the grandchildren with homework. She paid a small amount toward utilities every month from what little remained after her medical minimums. But invisible is an impossible standard to meet when you are a living, breathing reminder of mortality and misfortune inside someone else's carefully constructed life. The comments started small, little suggestions about senior apartment complexes, casual mentions of how the basement would make a wonderful craft room someday, quiet but pointed conversations about independence and not wanting her to feel like a burden. Carol stopped setting a place for her at Sunday dinners without explanation. Dennis started having hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly when Ruth walked into a room. And then one morning Dennis sat down across from her at the kitchen table with the look of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say many times and still wasn't ready to say it. He had found her an affordable room in a senior residential facility across town. He had already paid the first month's deposit. He thought it would be best for everyone. Ruth did not cry. She had spent too many years preserving things that others had discarded to waste tears on a situation she had not yet fully assessed. She packed her 2 suitcases and her box of books with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had spent 4 decades organizing other people's collections. She accepted the $5 Dennis pressed into her hand at the door. He'd said it was for bus fare and she hadn't corrected him, and she walked out onto Eldridge Street into a gray October morning. She was 73 years old. She had $5, 2 suitcases, and 41 years of expertise in recognizing value that other people had stopped looking at closely enough. She just didn't know yet how soon that expertise would matter. The Harwick Municipal Property Auction was held on the second Saturday of every month in the parking lot behind City Hall, a utilitarian event that attracted a specific kind of crowd. There were the professional investors, young and sharp-eyed, arriving in clean trucks with contractor plates and laptops already open. There were the casual bargain hunters, retirees mostly, flipping through the property listings with the relaxed curiosity of people who could afford to walk away empty-handed. And then there was Ruth Calloway, standing near the back in her good wool coat, the one she'd kept because it still looked presentable, holding a folded auction catalogue and trying to appear as though she had every reason in the world to be there. She had heard about the auction from Frank Okafor, her neighbor from Eldridge Street, a retired machinist in his late 60s who had checked in on her since she'd moved into the cramped residential room across town. Frank had mentioned it almost as an afterthought over coffee, said the city was clearing out a backlog of seized properties, some of them going for next to nothing because nobody wanted the liability. Ruth had written down the date. She wasn't entirely sure why. She had $5 and no plan. But 41 years of archival work had taught her that overlooked things sometimes held extraordinary value, and that the most important skill was simply being willing to look when everyone else had already turned away. The auction moved quickly through the first hour. The desirable properties, a vacant commercial unit on the main street, 2 residential lots near the new development corridor, a former auto shop with a functioning electrical panel, went fast and went high. A group of young investors in their early 30s dominated the bidding with the aggressive confidence of people who had never experienced a bid they couldn't recover from. They spoke loudly between themselves, checked their phones constantly, and treated the whole proceeding like a competitive sport with a clear scoreboard. Their leader, a tall young man named Brett Langley, wore a jacket that cost more than Ruth's monthly residential fee and had the particular energy of someone who had been told he was exceptional so consistently that he had stopped questioning it. Ruth watched them carefully and said nothing. By the second hour, the quality had dropped considerably. The remaining properties were the ones the catalogue politely described as requiring significant investment, which was a professional way of saying that the roof was gone, or the foundation had shifted, or the building inspector had written words like hazardous and condemnable in the official report. The crowd thinned noticeably. Brett Langley and his associates began packing their laptops, already done for the day, already planning wherever people like them went after successful Saturday mornings. The auctioneer, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Gary, reached the final listing with the resigned energy of someone finishing a shift that had gone on too long. Last property of the day, folks. Municipal Parcel 22, located at 9 Briar Industrial Court. Single-structure metal construction, approximately 1,600 square feet. City acquired this property 11 years ago following tax seizure from an estate. Building inspector's report cites significant surface corrosion, roof degradation, no active utilities, and condemned status pending scheduled demolition. City wants this off the books before the new budget cycle. Opening bid, he paused and looked around at the dwindling crowd with visible resignation. $50. Silence. Gary tried $25. More silence. Someone near the front audibly sighed. One of Brett Langley's associates, still lingering near the edge of the lot, glanced over with mild entertainment, the way someone looks at a minor inconvenience that doesn't affect them personally. $10, Gary offered, and the resignation in his voice had fully replaced any pretense of enthusiasm. Folks, this building has salvageable metal and the land has value if you're willing to do the work. Someone give me $10. Nothing. He exhaled. All right, I am authorized to accept any bid that clears this property from city inventory. $5. Anyone give me $5 and the deed is yours. Ruth's hand went up, quietly, without drama, the way she had always done things. Gary pointed at her with visible relief. $5 to the lady in the back. Do I hear 10? Anyone $10? Brett Langley turned around. He spotted Ruth, small, older, standing alone in her wool coat, and his expression moved through surprise into amusement with remarkable speed. He nudged his associate and said something low. Both of them laughed. Then Brett spoke loud enough for the surrounding area to hear. Ma'am, that building is literally scheduled for demolition. The city can't even give it away. You do understand that, right? His associate pulled out his phone. I'm getting this on video. This is incredible. Brett shook his head with theatrical pity. Someone's grandma just spent her grocery money on a condemned shack. That's either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the saddest. Honestly not sure which. The laughter was small but sharp, the kind designed to carry. Ruth did not look at them. She walked to the front table,
unfolded her $5 bill, and handed it to Gary with the steady hands of a woman who had spent 4 decades handling things far more delicate than money. "Sold," Gary said quietly. To bidder 31.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Frank Okafor had lent Ruth his car for the day, a 2003 Buick with a heater that worked inconsistently and a passenger seat permanently tilted 3 degrees to the left. Ruth sat behind the wheel in the City Hall parking lot for a long moment after the auction ended, holding her receipt and the single rusted key Gary had handed her with the apologetic expression of a man who genuinely wasn't sure he'd done her any favors. The key was old, not just old the way things get when they're neglected, scratched and dull from casual use, but old in a deliberate, engineered way, heavy, precisely cut, the kind of key manufactured to fit a lock designed to actually keep something out rather than simply suggest the idea of security. Ruth turned it over in her fingers with the slow attention of someone trained to read objects the way other people read text. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward the residential facility, replaying Brett Langley's laughter in her mind with the detached clarity of someone filing an unpleasant document in the correct folder. She had heard variations of that laughter her entire professional life. The quiet dismissal of librarians and archivists by people who confused access to information with the ability to evaluate it. The assumption that careful, methodical work was somehow less impressive than loud, fast work. She had outlasted every version of that laughter for 41 years. She was not particularly worried about this one. What she was thinking about was the building itself. She had noticed 3 things at 9 Briar Industrial Court that no one else in that parking lot had appeared to notice or had cared enough to look for. The first was the construction style. The metal paneling was a specific gauge and a specific joining method that she recognized not from construction expertise, but from a professional lifetime spent cataloging and cross-referencing documents. 11 years ago, before the Harwick County Library had digitized its municipal archives, Ruth had personally handled and cataloged a collection of industrial contractor records from the 1970s and 1980s. Among them had been a series of contracts and technical specifications from a regional fabrication company called Alderman Industrial Solutions, which had operated out of Columbus, Ohio from 1971 to 1994. Alderman had built specialized storage structures for clients who needed long-term, high-security, climate-resistant solutions. Universities, private collectors, state institutions. The company had been well regarded in a narrow professional circle, known for construction quality that significantly exceeded standard commercial specifications. Ruth had catalogued their records thoroughly enough to recognize their signature construction details: the panel gauge, the specific double-sealed joining method, the reinforced door frame design, the way a person recognizes handwriting they've studied closely. The second thing she had noticed was the door frame itself, which despite decades of surface rust showed zero structural warping. Buildings that were genuinely unsound warped, frames shifted, doors no longer sat correctly in their housings. The door at 9 Briar Industrial Court sat perfectly flush, which meant the underlying structure was almost certainly far more intact than the surface corrosion suggested. The third thing was the lock. Ruth had enough archival experience with historical hardware to recognize that the lock on that door was not a standard commercial unit. It was a specialized high-security mechanism of the kind used not for general storage, but for the protection of things with significant value. You did not install a lock like that on a building full of worthless contents. The cost of the lock alone, even in the 1980s, would have exceeded the value of most ordinary stored materials. Someone had stored something important in that building, something important enough to justify Alderman construction, a security lock, and a level of care that had kept the structure standing through 11 years of municipal neglect and decades before that of whatever history the building carried. Ruth turned onto the highway and drove through the gray October afternoon, thinking about what that something might be. She thought about the kinds of clients Alderman had served. She had catalogued enough of their records to know that their client list had included private collectors with significant resources, people who acquired things, art, rare objects, documents, collections that sometimes required secure long-term storage outside of conventional facilities, people who sometimes, for reasons that ranged from practical to complicated,
needed those collections to be quietly kept rather than publicly displayed. She thought about the fact that the city had held this property for 11 years following a tax seizure from an estate that had apparently never been properly settled, which meant whoever had originally paid for alderman construction and a high-security lock had either died without telling anyone about the contents or had been prevented from returning for them. Both possibilities pointed in the same direction.
There was something inside that building that had been waiting there, untouched, for a very long time. And Ruth Calloway, 73 years old, with $5 gone and a rusted key in her coat pocket, was quite possibly the only person in Harwick with the specific professional background to understand exactly why that mattered. She drove the rest of the way home in focused silence, already planning the morning. Frank Okafor lived in a house that looked exactly like what it was, the home of a man who had spent 4 decades working with his hands and never stopped. The garage alone contained more organized tools than most small hardware stores, arranged on pegboards with the particular precision of someone who had learned early that a misplaced tool on a job site cost time and time cost money. When Ruth knocked on his door that evening and explained what she needed, Frank stood in his doorway for a long moment with the careful expression of a man choosing his words thoughtfully. "You bought the property on Briar Industrial Court," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I did," Ruth confirmed. Frank was quiet for another moment. "The building inspector condemned that structure 2 years ago, Ruth. I know Gary from the City Works Department. He told me they were going to demolish it in the spring because the exterior corrosion had progressed past the point of reasonable safety assessment." "The exterior corrosion is cosmetic," Ruth said. "The underlying structure is Alderman Industrial Construction. I catalogued their contractor records at the library in 2009. The core framing on their buildings doesn't fail the way standard commercial construction does. I need bolt cutters, a good crowbar, 2 flashlights, and someone with enough sense to check structural integrity before walking through a door." Frank looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "Give me 10 minutes to get my gear." They arrived at 9 Briar Industrial Court the following morning at 7:30, while the light was still thin and the industrial street was completely empty. In full daylight, the building looked, if anything, worse than it had during the auction. The surface rust had progressed into deep orange-brown patches across every visible panel. A section near the roofline showed what appeared to be significant corrosion damage. Weeds had pushed through the cracked concrete around the foundation with the patient determination of things that had been growing undisturbed for years. Frank walked the perimeter slowly, running his hands along the panels the way a doctor checks for something specific rather than general. He examined joints, checked the roofline from different angles, crouched to inspect the foundation edge. Ruth watched him work and said nothing, having learned long ago that expert assessment required silence. He straightened up after 15 minutes and looked at her with an expression that mixed professional respect with genuine surprise. "You were right about the construction. These panels are heavy gauge, double sealed at every joint. The surface corrosion is bad, but it's surface. The frame underneath is solid. I've seen newer buildings in worse structural shape." He paused. Whoever built this did not cut corners. The door was the next challenge, and it was a significant one. Up close, the lock was even more substantial than Ruth had assessed from a distance. It was a multi-point security mechanism, the kind engineered for applications where access control was genuinely critical. The keyhole was intact and completely unobstructed, which meant it had been maintained or had simply been so well manufactured that decades of disuse hadn't degraded it. Ruth tried the key first. It entered the lock cleanly, which meant the mechanism was compatible, but years of inactivity had frozen the internal components beyond what simple turning pressure could overcome. Frank examined it with a machinist's eye and reached for a small can of penetrating lubricant from his kit. He applied it carefully around the keyhole and along the door seams and suggested they wait 20 minutes before trying again. They were on their 3rd attempt when a Harwick Police Department cruiser slowed to a stop on the street behind them. Officer Linda Marsh stepped out with the measured caution of someone trained to assess situations before committing to an interpretation. She was in her mid-40s, professional and unhurried, and she looked at the two of them, a 73-year-old woman and a 68-year-old man with bolt cutters, with the particular patience of an officer who had learned not to assume. "Folks," she said, "this building is condemned city property. I'm going to need you to step away from the door and explain what you're doing here." Ruth produced her auction receipt. It's my property. I purchased it legally at the municipal auction yesterday. She handed over the document with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to producing documentation on request. Officer Marsh examined the receipt carefully, looked at the building, looked back at Ruth. You bought this for $5. Yes, ma'am. Another long look at the building. And you're trying to get inside. I'm trying to access my own property, yes. Marsh handed back the receipt with an expression that was professionally neutral but contained, somewhere underneath it, the faint outline of bewilderment. The building is condemned. I can't stop you from accessing your own property, but I am strongly advising against entering without a professional structural assessment first. I have one, Ruth said, gesturing to Frank. Retired machinist, 40 years of industrial construction experience. He's assessed the structure and confirmed it's sound. Marsh looked at Frank. Frank gave a single nod of confirmation. The officer stood quietly for a moment, looked at the receipt one more time, then looked at Ruth with an expression that had shifted slightly, not into approval exactly, but into something closer to reluctant respect. All right, she said. Your property, your risk. Please be careful. She returned to her cruiser but did not immediately drive away. On the fourth attempt with the key, something inside the lock shifted with a deep mechanical click that resonated through the doorframe like a sound that had been waiting a very long time to happen. Ruth turned the key the rest of the way. The bolt retracted. The door, heavy and resistant from decades of sealed inactivity, swung slowly outward on hinges that groaned with the particular protest of metal returning to a function it had almost forgotten. Ruth and Frank stood in the doorway and looked into the darkness inside. Behind them, Officer Marsh had stepped out of her cruiser again. Ruth could hear the quiet sound of the car door closing. Even she, it seemed, wanted to know what was in there. The interior of the building at 9 Briar Industrial Court smelled the way Ruth imagined the inside of a sealed tomb might smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but dense with the particular stillness of air that had not moved or changed in a very long time. Dust hung in the beam of Frank's flashlight like something suspended in amber. The floor was concrete, clean and dry, which told Ruth immediately that the roof integrity had held better than the exterior suggested. No water damage, no debris. Whatever was in here had been sitting in essentially the same conditions since the door was last locked. And there was a great deal inside. The space was organized with a precision that Ruth recognized immediately as the work of someone professionally trained in collection management, not the casual stacking of a person storing things they intended to retrieve soon, but the deliberate, systematic arrangement of someone who understood long-term preservation. Wooden crates of varying sizes were arranged in rows along both walls, each one elevated slightly off the concrete floor on wooden pallets, a standard archival technique for protecting against moisture migration from the ground. Heavy cloth covers had been draped over larger items in the center of the space. Everything had been tagged with small white labels, handwritten in a neat, consistent script. Frank moved the flashlight beam slowly across the room, and Ruth followed it with the focused attention of someone reading a document rather than looking at a room. "Don't touch anything yet," she said quietly. "Let me look first." She moved along the first row of crates, reading the labels without touching them. The handwriting was careful and uniform. The labels listed dates, reference numbers, and brief descriptive notations. The dates ranged from 1981 to 1988. The reference numbers followed a cataloging system Ruth didn't immediately recognize but could see was internally consistent, the work of someone with real organizational training. She stopped at a label that read, Harwick Typographic Archive, Original Press Plates, 1886-1923. Handle with extreme care. Ruth stood very still. Frank moved the flashlight closer. "What does that mean?" Ruth didn't answer immediately. She was already moving to the next crate. Bound manuscript collection, pre-1900, provenance documentation enclosed. And the next, original illustration boards, Harwick Gazette, 1891-1917. And the next, photographic glass plate negatives, Harwick County Historical Collection, catalogued 1984. "Frank," she said, her voice carrying the particular quiet of someone trying to stay calm about something that does not feel calm. "Do you remember the Harwick County Historical Society theft, 1988? Frank was quiet for a moment, vaguely. "I was working in Columbus then. Something about a collection going missing. A big deal at the time." "It was an enormous deal," Ruth said. She was moving carefully between the rows now, reading every label with systematic thoroughness. The Harwick County Historical Society maintained one of the most significant regional archives in central Ohio. Original documents, rare print materials, photographic collections, historical press equipment, things that couldn't be replaced because nothing like them had been produced after a certain point in history. In October 1988, a significant portion of that collection was reported stolen. The investigation ran for 3 years. The FBI was involved. Insurance paid out claims totaling nearly $1.4 million. The collection was never recovered. Frank's flashlight beam moved slowly across the rows of crates as the weight of what she was saying settled into the space between them. "Are you telling me?" "I'm telling you I need to open one of these crates before I say anything else," Ruth said steadily. She chose the nearest one with care, working the lid with Frank's crowbar slowly and methodically, the way she had opened fragile document boxes for 4 decades. The interior was packed with acid-free tissue paper, the correct archival material, the expensive kind, and beneath it, wrapped in protective board and sealed in clear archival sleeves, were original letterpress printing plates. Iron and brass, heavy and precisely engraved, the kind used for newspaper and document printing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Ruth lifted one carefully and tilted it toward Frank's light. On the surface of the plate, in mirror image relief, she could read the words, "Harwick County Gazette, Est, 1887. She set it down with the same steadiness she had maintained through the entire morning and turned to Frank. "I need you to call the police. Not a casual call. I need you to go outside and call Officer Marsh before she drives away and tell her she needs to come inside and look at this. And I need you to tell her to call whoever handles historical property crimes because what is in this building is almost certainly the Harwick Historical Society collection that disappeared in 1988. Frank stared at her. "Ruth, go," she said quietly. "I'm going to keep documenting what I can see without touching anything else." Frank went. Ruth stood alone in the dusty silence of the building, surrounded by 37 years of carefully preserved history that the world had stopped looking for, and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she always had when handling something irreplaceable. Officer Linda Marsh walked into the building with the measured professionalism of someone who had trained herself never to look surprised. That training held for approximately 4 seconds. Then she stopped walking, swept her own flashlight slowly across the rows of crates and covered objects, and stood in complete silence for a moment that stretched long enough to feel significant. She turned to Ruth. "You said 1988? "October 14th, 1988, Ruth confirmed. "The theft was reported on a Monday morning when the Historical Society's head curator arrived to find the secure storage room emptied. The investigation determined that access had been gained over a weekend, most likely Friday night through Sunday. Whoever did it had professional knowledge of archival materials. Nothing was damaged or carelessly handled. Everything was taken with deliberate selectivity, the most historically significant and monetarily valuable items from the collection. The investigators concluded at the time that it was not opportunistic theft. It was planned by someone who knew exactly what they were taking and why." Marsh was already on her radio, speaking in the clipped, efficient language of law enforcement, shifting from routine patrol to something considerably more serious. She stepped outside for several minutes. Ruth could hear the conversation escalating in intensity without being able to make out the specific words. Frank stood near the door with his arms crossed, watching Ruth with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about how a Saturday morning could go. When Marsh came back inside, her entire professional posture had changed. She was sharper, more deliberate, moving with the focused energy of someone who understood they were standing at the center of something that was going to matter. "I've contacted the Harwick PD Detective Division and I've put in a call to the FBI field office in Columbus." She paused. Given the value of the collection and the federal involvement in the original investigation, this is going to move quickly. "I need you both to step outside and wait by the vehicle. Nobody touches anything further until we have proper evidence documentation personnel on site." Ruth and Frank waited outside in the thin October light for 2 hours and 40 minutes. A Harwick PD detective named Carol arrived within 30 minutes, followed by a second officer with a crime scene documentation kit. The FBI arrived from Columbus at 11:45, 2 agents in a dark SUV who moved with the particular efficiency of people who had been waiting a long time for a phone call like this one. The lead agent was Special Agent Diane Kowalski, a woman in her early 50s with sharp, assessing eyes and the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had worked significant cases long enough to know that patience produced better results than urgency.
She interviewed Ruth first, standing beside Frank's Buick in the industrial lot with a notepad and a recorder, asking questions in a sequence that Ruth recognized as carefully constructed, each one building precisely on the last, designed to establish timeline, knowledge, and intent with methodical clarity. When Ruth finished explaining the auction, the key, the construction identification, and the archival labels, Kowalski looked at her for a moment with an expression that was still professionally composed, but had something underneath it that was close to genuine respect. "You identified Alderman Industrial Construction from catalogued contractor records you processed in 2009, she said. "That's correct."
"And you recognize the archival organization inside as consistent with professional collection management." 41 years as a librarian and archivist, Ruth said, "You learn to read how things are organized the same way you learn to read text." Kowalski made a note. Then she went inside with her partner for a very long time. She emerged 90 minutes later with the focused stillness of someone carrying significant information carefully. She sat down with Ruth and Frank on the tailgate of a police vehicle and spoke with the directness of someone who had decided that plain language was the appropriate register for what she had to say. "We've done a preliminary documentation sweep and cross-referenced several of the reference numbers from the crate labels against the original 1988 theft inventory, which has been in our open case files since the investigation began. The numbers match. We are confident that what is in this building is the majority of the Harwick County Historical Society collection reported stolen 37 years ago." She paused. "This is one of the longest-standing unresolved cultural property theft cases in Central Ohio's federal records." Ruth absorbed this quietly. "Do you know who stored it here?" Kowalski pulled up something on her phone and turned the screen toward Ruth. "The property at 9 Briar Industrial Court was originally owned by a man named George Alderman Jr., son of the founder of Alderman Industrial Solutions. He died in 2003 at the age of 61 from a sudden cardiac event. No immediate family, no will. The estate was disputed among distant relatives for several years before everyone abandoned the liability of the industrial land. City seized it for unpaid taxes in 2013. Ruth looked at Frank. Frank looked at Ruth. "The son of the man who built the storage unit," Ruth said slowly, "used his father's building to hide a stolen collection that he apparently never told anyone about. And then he died without retrieving it." Kowalski nodded. "George Alderman Jr. was investigated twice in the early 1990s in connection with the theft. He had professional access to the Historical Society's facility through a building maintenance contract his company held at the time. He had the knowledge to handle archival materials correctly. He had the means to store them securely. But the FBI never found the physical evidence and the case went cold." She looked at the building behind her. Until today, the collection had been sitting there for 37 years, perfectly preserved in an Alderman industrial structure built to last, waiting in a condemned building that everyone had dismissed as worthless, on a forgotten street that economic development had bypassed decades ago, waiting for someone who knew how to look at overlooked things and see what was actually there. Ruth sat quietly in the October light and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not excitement exactly, something steadier and deeper than excitement. The particular satisfaction of a lifetime of careful, methodical work arriving, unexpectedly and completely, at exactly the right moment. The story leaked on a Wednesday, 4 days after the discovery, despite the FBI's careful management of information around an active federal case. A local journalist named Pete Hadley, who covered municipal affairs for the Harwick Daily Register and had attended the auction as background research for an unrelated story about city property management, had noticed Ruth's $5 bid and followed up out of professional curiosity. When he connected the condemned building on Briar Industrial Court to the police activity reported there the following morning, he made several calls to sources inside the City Works Department and had enough for a front-page story by Tuesday evening. The headline ran Wednesday morning, "Retired librarian pays $5 for condemned shed, discovers $1.4 million in stolen historical artifacts inside." By Wednesday afternoon it had been picked up by the Columbus Dispatch. By Thursday morning it was on the Associated Press wire. By Thursday evening, national television producers were calling the Harwick Police Department press line asking for comment, and Ruth's name was appearing in news alerts across the country, with the particular velocity of a story that contained every element audiences found irresistible: an elderly underdog, an extraordinary discovery, a decades-old mystery, and a dramatic reversal of fortune so complete it seemed almost fictional. Ruth heard about the coverage from Frank, who called her at the residential facility on Thursday morning with the slightly dazed energy of a man watching something accelerate beyond any reasonable expectation. He read her 3 of the headlines over the phone. She listened without interrupting, thanked him, and sat quietly on the edge of her narrow bed for a moment, processing the information with the same methodical steadiness she brought to everything. Then she called Special Agent Kowalski to ask what she needed to know about the reward process. The Federal Cultural Property Recovery Program, Kowalski explained, provided rewards to individuals who recovered and immediately reported stolen property in cases where federal investigative resources had been significantly committed. The Harwick Historical Society theft had been an active federal case for 3 years in the early 1990s before going cold, with substantial documented investigative expenditure. The assessed value of the recovered collection at the time of the original theft had been $1.4 million. The reward structure for a recovery of this nature was 10% of that assessed value. That's $140,000, Ruth said. Before taxes, Kowalski confirmed. The net figure after federal and state withholding would be approximately $105,000 to $115,000 depending on your specific tax situation. The formal process takes 60 to 90 days, but I can tell you this recovery is significant enough that the paperwork will be prioritized. She paused. There's also the question of current valuation. The Historical Society's insurance company, which technically holds ownership of the recovered collection, has indicated they intend to commission a current market appraisal. Archival collections of this historical significance have appreciated considerably. Some individual items in that building may be worth multiples of their 1988 insured value. That doesn't change the federal reward calculation, but it does affect the media and public interest around the story, which has its own value.
Ruth hired a lawyer named Sandra Greer on Friday, recommended by Frank, who knew her from a community board they had both served on years earlier. Sandra was in her late 50s, compact and precise, with the efficient manner of someone who had spent 3 decades protecting people from being taken advantage of during moments of vulnerability. She took one look at the volume of media inquiries already accumulating and immediately began managing access with the systematic control of someone who understood that story value decreases in direct proportion to how freely it is given away. "You have more leverage than you realize," Sandra told Ruth in her office on Friday afternoon, in language Ruth found immediately familiar because it was the language of someone who had assessed a collection and understood its worth. "There are 3 documentary production companies that have already reached out. 2 major publishers have expressed interest in a book. A speakers bureau has been in contact about corporate and institutional engagements, and the Harwick County Historical Society itself has issued a public statement calling you, and I'm quoting directly, an extraordinary example of professional expertise and civic responsibility." The media coverage continued to grow through the following week. Every outlet that covered the story also covered Brett Langley's video, which had been posted to his professional social media account on the day of the auction, with a caption that described Ruth as, in his exact words, a confused elderly woman who just wasted $5 on a pile of rust. The caption was still live when the national coverage broke on Thursday. By Friday, it had been screenshot and shared hundreds of thousands of times. By Saturday, his account had been made private, but the screenshots were permanent. The comments sections were unambiguous. "You filmed yourself mocking a retired librarian and archivist who then immediately solved a 37-year-old FBI case with her $5 purchase. The level of incorrectness achieved here is almost impressive." Another, "This is what happens when you confuse confidence with competence. She spent $5. You spent 20 minutes laughing at someone smarter than you." Brett Langley's company lost 2 commercial real estate clients in the following week. He issued a public statement describing the video as a moment of poor judgment he sincerely regretted. The internet received the statement with the particular skepticism it reserved for apologies issued after consequences rather than before them. Meanwhile, Sandra had finalized 2 deals within 10 days of the story breaking. A documentary production company offered $120,000 for exclusive rights to Ruth's story, including access to the discovery timeline and cooperation with the FBI case narrative. A publisher offered a $60,000 advance for a book about the experience, with royalty structures that could increase that figure substantially depending on sales. A speakers bureau confirmed bookings at institutional and corporate events, averaging $6,000 per appearance, with a calendar that already had 7 engagements confirmed for the following 3 months. The FBI reward was processed in 58 days, faster than the standard window, as Kowalski had suggested it would be. $140,000 before taxes, $108,000 after withholding. Ruth sat in Sandra's office the afternoon the wire transfer confirmed and did the arithmetic carefully. The federal reward, the documentary deal, the book advance, and the initial speaking fees totaled approximately $330,000, more money than she had earned in any decade of her working life, more money than she had believed she would ever hold again after the morning Dennis had pressed a $5 bill into her hand on the doorstep of the house she had lived in for 31 years. She thought about that $5 bill for a moment, the same one she had handed to Gary at the auction, the perfect, complete circularity of it. Then she thought about what came next.
The first thing Ruth did was call Dennis, not to announce anything, not to demonstrate vindication in the particular sharp way that the situation might have justified. She called because he was her son, and because she had not spoken to him since the morning she walked out of the house on Eldridge Street, and because she had spent enough of her life preserving things to understand that some things required deliberate maintenance or they deteriorated beyond recovery. The conversation was short and uncomfortable in the way that honest conversations between people who have hurt each other tend to be. Dennis had seen the news coverage. He had called the residential facility twice already and been told Ruth was unavailable. He said he was sorry. Ruth listened to the apology the way she listened to everything, carefully, completely, without interrupting. Then she told him she accepted it and that she would like to have dinner with him and Carol and the grandchildren when she was settled. She did not tell him what settled meant yet. She had not entirely decided. The second thing she did was contact Victor Harmon. Harmon was the real estate investor who had purchased her house on Eldridge Street at the bank auction 8 months earlier. He was a practical man in his early 60s who answered his phone directly and spoke without unnecessary decoration, which Ruth appreciated. She explained who she was. He said he knew he had seen the news coverage like everyone else in Harwick. She asked if the property was still available and what it would take for him to sell. Harmon had paid $165,000 at auction. He had invested another $15,000 in maintenance and carrying costs. He had a development interest pending but not yet contracted. For $210,000 cash with a 30-day close, he said, he would walk away from the development conversation and she could have her house back. Ruth said she would have her lawyer contact him by end of day. Sandra Greer finalized the purchase contract in 4 days. Ruth signed the closing papers in a conference room on the 3rd floor of a downtown Harwick law firm, in a building 3 blocks from the library where she had worked for 4 decades, and wrote a check for $210,000 against her new account without a mortgage, without a loan, without any instrument of debt whatsoever. She handed it across the table with the steady hands of a woman who had decided that she would never again sign a document that gave someone else authority over her home. She moved back into the house on Eldridge Street on a Thursday in early December. The garden had been neglected for 8 months and would need significant work in the spring. The leaking gutter had been repaired by Harmon's maintenance crew, which was an accidental improvement she accepted without comment. She unpacked her 2 suitcases and her box of books and put everything back where it belonged with the quiet satisfaction of someone restoring a collection to its proper order. But the house was not the whole plan. It had never been the whole plan. The Morrison Community Workshop in the original story had given Ruth an idea she had been developing since the afternoon in Sandra's office when the arithmetic had confirmed she had more resources than she needed for simple personal security. The building at 9 Briar Industrial Court was still her property. The FBI had seized the contents as evidence, and the Historical Society had begun the process of formally reclaiming the collection. But the structure itself, solid alderman industrial construction underneath its weathered exterior, belonged to Ruth Calloway. She hired a contractor named Bill Osei, recommended by Frank, who walked through the building with professional attention and confirmed what Frank had assessed from the outside. The structure was fundamentally sound. Renovation was entirely viable. The cost to bring it to full functional standard, treating the exterior corrosion, resealing the panels, rebuilding the interior, installing utilities, HVAC lighting, and accessibility features, would run approximately $95,000 done correctly. Ruth authorized the work immediately. Her vision for the space had been shaped by 4 decades of watching what happened when people lost access to resources they needed to do meaningful work. She had seen it at the library constantly. Retired professionals, elderly residents, people with genuine expertise and real capability who lacked access to the tools, the space, the equipment, and the community that would allow them to keep contributing. She had been one of those people herself, 8 months ago, standing on a cracked sidewalk with 2 suitcases and a $5 bill. She called the renovated building the Harwick Archive and Skills Center. The name was deliberate. Archive because preservation was at the heart of everything she believed about value. The idea that things others had stopped looking at carefully still contained worth that patient attention could recover. Skills because the center's purpose was not passive. It was not a place to sit and remember what you used to be able to do. It was a place to keep doing it. The center opened on a Saturday in late April, 7 months after Ruth had handed Gary her last $5 bill at the municipal auction. Frank Okafor had built the workbenches himself, refusing payment with the particular stubbornness of a man who considered it a personal project rather than a professional service. The classroom area had 12 computers with high-speed internet, donated partially through a grant Sandra had secured from a regional community development foundation, and partially through a corporate sponsorship that Brett Langley's formal written apology and $8,000 donation had unexpectedly helped attract. Other local businesses, aware of the story and its public reception, had responded to the donation by contributing their own. Ruth had framed Brett's letter and hung it near the entrance with a small plaque beneath it. The plaque read, "Every overlooked thing contains value that careful attention can recover. This applies to buildings, to collections, and to people." 61 people attended the opening. The youngest was 63. The oldest was 84. A retired newspaper typesetter spent the first afternoon teaching 3 other seniors how to operate a small letterpress machine Ruth had acquired through a historical society donation, a working press from the same era as the plates recovered from the Alderman building, a detail that felt less like coincidence and more like completion. A former schoolteacher began offering free writing workshops in the classroom space every Tuesday. A 71-year-old woman who had spent 30 years as a seamstress and been quietly pushed into retirement started teaching garment construction and within 2 months had a waiting list. Special Agent Diane Kowalski attended the opening and stayed for 2 hours, moving through the space with genuine interest. Before she left, she shook Ruth's hand and said, in the direct way Ruth had come to appreciate, that in 30 years of federal investigative work she had never seen a cold case resolved by someone reading contractor records they had catalogued 15 years earlier and spending $5 on the correct conclusion. Ruth thanked her and said she had simply paid attention to something everyone else had decided wasn't worth their time. That, Kowalski said, is a significantly underrated skill. The documentary aired 11 months after the opening, on a streaming platform with national reach. The response generated a second wave of media coverage and a substantial increase in speaking invitations, all of which Ruth accepted selectively and directed through Sandra, with fees going directly into the center's operating fund. A feature in a national magazine described the center as a model for community-based senior engagement that other cities had already begun inquiring about replicating. Dennis came to the opening with Carol and the grandchildren. He spent a long time walking through the space looking at everything carefully. Before he left, he found Ruth near the entrance and stood beside her for a moment without speaking, looking at the framed letter and the plaque beneath it. Then he said quietly that he was proud of her. Ruth accepted that the same way she had accepted his apology, completely, without conditions, without using it as an opportunity for anything other than what it actually was. On the 1-year anniversary of the opening, Ruth stood before the assembled members and volunteers of the Harwick Archive and Skills Center and gave a short speech. She said that she had spent 41 years as an archivist because she believed that the things other people stopped paying attention to were often the ones that mattered most. She said that when she had stood at the back of a municipal parking lot with her last $5, she had not been acting on hope. She had been acting on knowledge, specific, hard-earned, professional knowledge that decades of careful work had given her,
and that no one could take away regardless of what else they managed to remove from her life. She said that this building, this center, this community was the direct result of paying attention when it would have been easier to look away, and that every person in the room carried exactly that same capacity. The capacity to see value in places other people had dismissed, to bring expertise that the world had told them was finished, to build something meaningful from materials everyone else had written off as rust. She looked around at the room full of people engaged in purposeful, skillful, joyful work, and finished quietly. "We paid $5 for this," she said, "but what we really bought was proof that being written off is not the same as being finished, and that the things which endure are almost always the ones that were built better than they looked." The applause was long and warm and completely genuine.
Afterward, Ruth and Frank drove back to Eldridge Street in the old Buick, with the heater running inconsistently and the passenger seat still tilted 3 degrees to the left. Ruth looked out the window at the familiar streets of Harwick in the April evening light and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, entirely and completely at home. Not because she had recovered what she lost, but because she had built something better from the materials that remained. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.